Thank you, Dr. Narayanan. Very impressive, I think, performance and some great ambitions for the future for the Institute. So, congratulations and keep up the good work. My warmest congratulations to those of you who will be receiving your degrees today. You have gone out into a world which offers far greater opportunity to build a career and make a mark in your life than any generation before you has experienced. You have access to information and new and powerful technologies that can transform for the better the quality of life of the communities which you form part of. So use these well and proceed first towards success and thereafter towards influence as you leave your footprints on this world. Now, our world, of course, can no longer be understood in simple terms. It has been described as a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And particularly at this point of time, given the geopolitical risks that we are seeing, I thought I'd spend a few minutes describing this world and then talk to you about our country, about India's place in this world, and then finally the role that each of you, if you choose, can play within this overall context. When I was growing up, the world lived under the shadow of the Cold War, a bipolar construct with a US-led and a Soviet Union-led alliance, each dominating world politics and the global economy. Then through the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet bloc, we saw the emergence of a very weak Russian state and talk about a unipolar world with the United States assuming some of the trappings of the world's policeman. The opening up of the former Soviet bloc and a wave of economic reforms, including in our country, including in China, seeded liberal market dynamics across a major chunk of the global economy. I think corporations in the West were amongst the first to seize the opportunity to extend their supply chains to low-cost economies like China. And India, of course, was one of the big beneficiaries of the wave of IT outsourcing that took place, especially after Indian IT companies had proved their mettle, proved their capability during the Y2K situation at the turn of the century. This period also saw the genesis of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, dedicated to breaking down barriers to global trade. So much so that commentators at this time wondered if the growing prosperity all of this was stimulating around the world meant that a new balance was being achieved in international relations and more peaceful ties based on trade and openness between nations. Sadly, those expectations were quickly demolished by the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York in 2001, which set in motion a chain of military interventions and economic destruction across the world. The hope that the global economy would sustain measured growth was also demolished by the discovery of serious weaknesses in the business models of financial services giants leading up to the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, the impact of which we are still feeling. Now, meanwhile, amidst the economic and political and military turmoil, there was, of course, one nation which steadily grew its economy and achieved the unique distinction of an annual 10% plus growth rate for over 2 decades and emerged as a potential competitor to all that hitherto the world's premier economy, the United States, was expected to deliver. And that nation was, of course, China. In this past decade, from encouraging homegrown companies to adopt global ambitions, to expanding its footprint across Europe, offering aid to African countries, and outlining a bold Belt and Road vision, China emerged as the strongest challenger to US dominance of international relations. And the high point of the prestige it achieved was at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2017, when many people compared the speeches delivered by President Xi Jinping and the newly elected President Trump of the US. The speeches were contrasted to show that where President Xi stood for an interdependent and closely knit international trading system and global economy, President Trump was pledging to protect America first. Xi argued, and I quote, that blaming economic globalization for the world's problems is inconsistent with reality. Instead, he said globalization has powered global growth and facilitated the movement of goods and capital, advances in science, technology, and civilization, and interactions among people. Since Davos in 2017, however, much has changed, and the situation we now see is one where China is slowing down and economic activity is beginning to migrate from that economy to some lower wage economies, and significant pressure is now coming from the United States to reduce China's trade surplus. In particular, we are also seeing the US aggressively challenge the technology dominance that China has been seeking to achieve. Now, when you judge what people really mean, I think you should look at what they say as well as what they do. And I think there is no better illustration of what the United States intent is than what was said in a speech given in October by the US Vice President Pence at the Hudson Institute, which is remarkable for its clarity on the US position on the trade issues we now see with China. He said, and I quote, "After the fall of the Soviet Union, we assumed, this is America, we assumed that a free China was inevitable. Heady with optimism at the turn of the 21st century, America agreed to give Beijing open access to our economy, and we brought China into the World Trade Organization. Previous administrations made this choice in the hope that freedom in China would expand in all its forms, not just economically, but politically, with profound respect for classical liberal principles, private property, personal liberty, religious freedom, the entire family of human rights. But that hope, in the US's estimation, has gone unfulfilled." And he went on to say that through the Made in China 2025 plan, the Communist Party has set its sights on controlling 90% of the world's most advanced industries, including robotics, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. To win the commanding heights of the 21st century economy, Beijing has directed its bureaucrats and businesses to obtain intellectual property, the foundation of American economic leadership, by any means necessary. And he vowed, "We will protect the private property interests of American enterprise." So the trade war that is now going on between the US and China, and the expectations that it may or may not get resolved over the next 10 days, there is a March 1st deadline for this, is intimately tied to this perception that it's actually not just about trade, it's about control of the commanding heights of the future economy, which is intimately linked with your intellectual property and control of technology. And I think in India we need to understand that very, very clearly. This is one issue, by the way, that is unifying political opinion in the United States. Though, as we see on CNN every day, there are many other issues that divide the US, not the least of which is the wall between the US and Mexico. And in fact, with President Trump, I think right from the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty, to the recasting of the NAFTA agreement, to the exit from UNESCO and the United Nations Human Rights Council, President Trump is upending many settled views about the institutions that offer continuity from the past and a sense of stability about the future. And the disruptions that have been set in motion as a result may take a long time to sort themselves out. Now, there have been other more deep-seated disruptions as well. The dynamics of global economic integration since the 1990s, while they've improved living standards across many parts of the world, have clearly also disrupted societal norms in many communities. So satellite television access to the World Wide Web, and cheaper air travel have opened the eyes of many of us to what the good life in the West might look like. But it's also generated new debates on the distribution of power, economic opportunity, issues of inequality and gender bias in societies. Not all of which is a bad thing. But sensing the anxieties that these and other challenges to orthodoxies create in communities, and in an effort to restore confidence and pride, you're seeing a wave of leaders emerging across the globe on platforms of robust nationalism. These include people like President Erdogan in Turkey, President Bolsonaro in Brazil, President Putin in Russia. So when you put all of this together, it's obvious that we currently, at this point of time, have an international order which is unstable. The strongest military and economic power in the world, the United States, is riven by internal differences between the Republicans and the Democrats, and it's led by a president who's less concerned about institutional stability and more concerned about putting America first. The next strongest power is China, but before it could quite ascend the pinnacle of global domination, it has been checked by a combination of the laws of economics and aggressive US posturing. The European Union, meanwhile, is significantly weakened by the UK's decision to leave, Brexit. An adventurous Russia is trying to reclaim some of its past influence around the world. And the larger emerging economies like India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa are today struggling to find their bearings in a world where their economic and military clout is admittedly modest in comparison to the size of their population. So as I said at the start, we are well and truly in the midst of a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. The certainties of the past have vanished at a time when the pace of change we are witnessing is unprecedented in human history. So what should an emerging economy like India do in this new and disorienting context we find ourselves in? I'd suggest that there are four major areas of focus that we need to keep in the forefront. First, we must battle hard for the maintenance of the instruments of national and international rule-making and preserve the integrity of institutions like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. A rules-based regime that gives a voice to even the weakest is far more preferable to one where the strong dominate. An international trading system that allows access to the fruits of ingenuity, wherever in the world these may be developed, is far more preferable to one where developments in areas like science and technology remain enclosed within national borders, with the benefits being denied to other nations. The same applies to the rules-based environment governing international financial flows. Remember that India is going to need a huge volume of financial transfers, at least $1 trillion over the next decade, to fund infrastructure creation in this country alone, and we have to facilitate the movement of this capital into our country. Second, in an interconnected world, we will have to accept that the influence and expanding play of non-state actors is here to stay. Now, we should try and limit the activities of such players only if they are prejudicial to national security. Otherwise, trying to shut down borders or closing off the economy is a sure recipe for disaster. In an age when the internet has democratized information access for every human being, it's going to be very hard to try and control minds or to prevent individuals from exercising personal choice. So we have to learn to be tolerant and to encourage the interplay of ideas. I'm reminded of the immortal words of Swami Vivekananda in his famous Chicago speech to the Parliament of Religions when he said, "Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant, fanaticism, have long possessed this beautiful earth. They filled the earth with violence, drenched it often, and often with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair. Had it not been for these horrible demons, human society would be far more advanced than it is now." Third, we must identify sources of national competence in order to remain internationally relevant. This could be building on our special skills and unique talents, including our IT capabilities to gain economic strength. It could be leveraging the natural beauty and cultural diversity of this country to attract many more international tourists. It could be around encouraging biodiversity hotspots that nurture plant and animal life that will offer solutions to future medicinal challenges. Critical in all of this must be the creation of an ecosystem in which innovation is allowed to thrive and intellectual property rights are secured. Fourth and finally, we must ensure that we maintain domestic stability on the back of an inclusive developmental framework where gross inequality is eliminated. And this last point is very important. We will inevitably, in this fast changing world, be victims from time to time of volatility. If you have significant inequality inbuilt in your society, there will always be this temptation for those who lose out, the victims, so to speak, to try and identify those allegedly responsible for their suffering amongst others in the community and punish them. And the consequences can be violent and nasty. And in this last context, I think two issues in particular, I believe, will test the strength of the social fabric of our communities in India and the inclusiveness that citizens experience. And I think all of you have a very important role to play in addressing both of these issues. The first is the rising level of automation in the workplace and its impact on employment. And the second is the concern over environmental degradation. And I'm going to talk about both of these in turn. On the first issue, as robotics and the Internet of Things become ubiquitous, manual labor will get significantly eliminated. And jobs that can occupy many man hours will vanish. A few years back, if you might recall that the World Bank president actually cited a study that the World Bank did, which suggested that automation could threaten 69% of the jobs in India. The largest threat would be to workers employed in sectors like manufacturing, retailing, construction, and transport, jobs that are routine, repetitive, and can be easily automated. So in such a rapidly evolving landscape, the ability to anticipate and prepare for future skills requirements will be critical, and continuous learning will have to become part of all of our DNA. With the largest poor population in the world here in India, it will be critical that we stretch every muscle and every sinew to support innovation and create new jobs. Part of the challenge, of course, will lie in addressing a number of structural elements in the Indian ecosystem to stimulate large-scale innovation and entrepreneurship. We often point with pride to the fact that in the US, in Silicon Valley, a large percentage of the CEOs are now of Indian origin. They're transforming the US economy, they're transforming the United States competitiveness. We need to replicate in India the same kind of ecosystem that Silicon Valley has created in the last half century. This would mean making it easier for entrepreneurs in India to attract risk capital, ensuring strong protection of intellectual property, and prodding big corporates to support small entrepreneurs by sharing the challenges they seek to solve and also becoming anchor customers for the solutions that the entrepreneurs develop. And government also needs to be coaxed to reduce administrative complexity while increasing the ease of doing business by eliminating regulations that no longer serve their purpose. I believe corporate India also needs to introspect. Too few Indian corporates currently invest any significant amounts in R&D and in creating a culture that rewards meaningful and reasonable risk-taking. I spent many years in the Tata Group. One of the awards for innovation we had was called Dare to Try. And this was an award that the chairman of the group would give actually to recognize innovations that were fueled by big ambitions but actually failed. And the idea was, if you don't recognize risk-taking, failure, and disappointment and the fact that these are essential parts of the innovation journey, you will not really see innovation happening. The Indian economy's R&D spend today of around 0.7% of GDP pales in comparison to the vast sums that other economies and multinational enterprises are investing. So if you take blue-blooded innovators, a company like Apple spends 6% of its total sales on R&D. Google's R&D spends run into double digits annually. They are far ahead. Yet in India, even in an industry like IT, which has played such an important role in the last 20 years, you have one of the pioneers of the industry, the Infosys founder, Mr. Narayan Murthy, saying recently, and I quote him, "The biggest challenge that the Indian IT industry has faced in the last 40 years and has still not solved is the inability to move from being reactive problem solvers to proactive problem definers and solvers." And this is a huge cultural issue in India. Huge investment in training by companies and a lot of hard work by employees are needed to overcome this cultural challenge. There's also a larger challenge here for the Indian economy. Given our substantial reliance on fuel imports, there is already an inbuilt structural imbalance in Indian trade, which needs to be corrected by a much larger volume of exports than is currently the case. If the burgeoning protectionist tendencies you're seeing around the world get accentuated, the structural imbalance in Indian trade will increase. And yet today the bulk of India's exports are actually relatively undifferentiated products, and we form part of a global supply chain in many cases where our country can be easily replaced by other countries that have similar or better quality and delivery capability. So if we don't rapidly expand our focus on innovation, there is this genuine risk that we will get left behind. The second issue I said I wanted to touch upon that will have significant societal impact is the concern about environmental degradation. And this has both local and global implications. At the local level, the pressure of urbanization on infrastructure and housing is going to be huge. And it's inevitable in the context of several 100 million Indians who are expected to migrate from their home geography to other parts of India over the next decade. The degradation this is going to create can be gauged from the fact that already, as per the World Health Organization's ambient air pollution standard measures, around half of the top 20 most polluted cities in the world are today in India. And they have air pollution levels that are 5 times the WHO guidelines. At the global level, a growing global population is also placing huge demands on the natural environment. We're now reaching what is called the Earth Overshoot Day, the day when humanity's demand for ecological resources and services in a given year exceeds what the Earth can regenerate in that same year. Ideally, it should be at the end of December, if at all. It's now actually come down to August, which is simply frightening. Late last year, many of you would have noted, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that the pace of global warming is much faster than we anticipated. And unless critical actions are taken far sooner than was even projected at the Paris Convention, we would be looking at significant adverse outcomes. So global environmental issues like global warming, ozone depletion, and the loss of biodiversity all call for international cooperation. No one nation can solve these problems on its own. The collaboration of all countries is required for their resolution. The good news, as I said earlier, is that there are solutions. We have the technology today, but it will require a new focus within the corporate world. It will be on all of your shoulders to develop the right model of sustainable growth, one that values the various forms of capital, not just financial capital, but social capital, natural capital, that centers on the creation of a circular and sharing economy. And all of you as young students and budding managers must play your role in delivering these solutions. This will require collaboration across stakeholder groups. It will require innovation, and it will require excellent execution. The resources, as I said, are available. They today rest, in some cases, the governments, the public sector, some cases the private sector, some cases the ideas and the passion and the talent is in the non-profit sector. The resources will be made available. So, in conclusion, I would urge you to adopt 3 mantras. First, put your personal might behind creating national and international rules-based institutions. Second, encourage collaborative thinking and collaboration across stakeholder groups. And third, focus on innovation to find solutions for mankind's problems. I started by saying that you go into a world that offers far greater opportunity to build a career and make an impact than any generation before you has ever experienced. So go with confidence that you have better access to information and technology than any previous generation. Go with the courage of conviction and go with the determination to make your own mark. I wish you all the very, very best. Thank you very much.